couldn't agree more. Certainly based on my experience as a Black person at Columbia University, where I graduated a year ago. It's just, it could not be more crystal clear the extent to which so many people of color, LGBTQ people, and so forth, that really had no disadvantages in life were nevertheless benefiting from a culture that put a primacy on a very superficial kind of victimhood. Not even real victimhood, just membership in this category. And it seemed, it was so clear to me my whole life that class was so important. And this actually connects to my opinion about the word Latinx. So I'm half Puerto Rican on my mom's side, and she grew up in the South Bronx in the 70s when that was, synonymous with crime and chaos and so forth. And she came from a very poor background. And so we would visit my Bronx Puerto Rican family all the time as a kid. And I learned Spanish through having to talk to my grandmother and so forth. And I remember when I went to Columbia in 2015 or 2016, I, for the first time, heard this word Latinx, which as a pretty good Spanish speaker at the time, sounded completely not only like not a Spanish word, but a word that actually couldn't exist given the logic of the Spanish language. Is it like a bastardization and anglicization of the language? And I was meeting these kids that were using this word that I felt probably had far less contact with the actual Hispanic community, saying, well, this is what Hispanics are demanding now. And I'm thinking to myself, I just visited my grandma and my 15 cousins in the Bronx last week. Nobody's using this word. If I brought up this word to them, they would fucking laugh at me. And so that, I mean, I do think that really highlights the extent to which social bubbles are very thick, and people have to be made aware of them, or else it's an issue that has big consequences for the country, because the more you are an elite and ensconced in elite bubbles and not prodded to think about the extent to which your elite sensibilities are not representative of the country, the more you run into this problem of the public simply not trusting the elites at all. And this is another, I think, big theme in your recent writing is trust in the media is just steadily going down, sort of has been since probably the 70s. This can also lead to just policies that seem to make no sense to the majority of people in a democracy, where it's supposed to be that the policies are sort of driven by what the people want. And a recent example you wrote about was the Biden coronavirus relief bill that was ruled unconstitutional, but was proposed to have racial preferences to determine which restaurants got relief. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose to write about that?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting case. I felt like it was really an incredibly vivid kind of vignette into a lot of these disputes and conflicts we're talking about. So the coronavirus bill, relief bill that was enacted in March, had a provision in it that provided relief to restaurants, basically smaller restaurants that had been suffering, obviously, because of lockdowns and isolation and the like. And I'm just trying to recall the policy details because they were important. In the bill, I think it was something like several $1 billion allocated to this fund, $29 billion, something like that. In this bill, what it did was it required that the Small Business Administration administrate and oversee the program of allocating grants and relief payments to small business owners who were restaurant owners. And it provided that there should be a 21-day period where the first 21 days, the only people who are permitted to actually have their applications considered are people who are restaurants where at least 51% or more is owned by someone from a minority group with a history of oppression. And so the Small Business Administration used their regulations that define what groups are minority groups with a history of oppression. And it meant that if you're African American or Latino or from certain Asian countries, then you qualify. But if you are from certain Middle Eastern countries, then you don't. And the appellate court that decided this lawsuit, it was brought by, and this is another really interesting aspect, was the lawsuit was brought by a restaurant where it was owned by a married couple that had been struggling to meet its payroll or to pay its rent and was in danger of going out of business. So it applied for one of these Small Business Administration payments on the very first day that the process was open. And it was owned by a married couple, 50-50. The husband is white and the wife is Latina. So if she had owned 51% instead of 50%, they would have been eligible to be considered within that first 21-day period. But because 50% was owned by a white person, they had to go back to the very back of the line. And the SBA was barred from even considering their application until the ones that had the special racial-based privilege were first considered. And they were obviously worried that the fund was going to be exhausted before that 21-day period ended. And they got to them because they actually desperately needed the money. They weren't just suing for fun. They really needed that payment for their restaurant to survive. And the appellate court, in a 2-1 decision, ruled that it was unconstitutional to decide who gets relief and who doesn't based on what race or ethnicity they belong to, like a seemingly very uncontroversial proposition that you just look at the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause and you would think would become an automatic result that every citizen is entitled to equal protection under the law and was designed to prohibit discriminating and deciding who gets what based on their race. But it was a 2-1 decision. The majority opinion was written by a judge who is the son of Indian immigrants. His parents are both from India. They immigrated to the United States. He was born in the United States. And he gave this really powerful analogy, which is India is one of the countries considered a minority group with historical oppression, but Afghanistan is not. So he said, imagine 2 childhood friends. One is from India, one is Afghanistan. They both have stores, restaurants in the same area. They're both suffering for the same reason, namely COVID lockdowns. They both go to apply for this loan, for this relief. And the person from India gets to go to the front of the line and gets the payment, but the person from Afghanistan has to go to the back of the line because the law doesn't consider him to be part of, for whatever reason, this minority group that is entitled to priority. And he essentially said that there's few things worse that a government can do than start dividing and divvying up people by race and determining who gets what benefits based on that. And the reason I thought it was so interesting was because it's so often talked about, this question, say like in elite settings of affirmative action at Yale or, private schools. But these are just like working class people. Why would you want to take like a white working class couple struggling to pay their bills and put them to the back of the line along with people who are from the wrong countries simply based on their race and deny them relief to survive in a way that other people get? So in addition to being unconstitutional, the judge observed that this is a really dangerous thing to start doing. It's going to breed resentment. It's going to balkanize the country in a way that we were describing earlier, like to the extent that you want to encourage and foster people to not necessarily ignore their racial differences, but to come together despite them. What could you do to inflame racial divisions more than saying that this race and this ethnicity gets these benefits, but those go to the back of the line and don't? And so I just found it to be a very interesting opinion. The dissent was written by an African-American judge who was appointed by President Obama. And she did a great job of conveying the strongest argument in defense of the view that it is constitutional, which is namely that those groups clearly from the data have been historically oppressed, and therefore the state has an interest in rectifying that historical oppression by kind of balancing the scales in their favor. And I just found that the way the case played out, the skill and sophistication of each judge's argument to be really worthy of consideration, given all the debates about race and equity and preferences and divisions that we're having in this country.
Yeah, I think this debate is mirrored in all kinds of aspects of society right now. Obviously, it becomes more poignant during a crisis when people are literally going out of business. But in principle, this is sort of something we have to decide as a nation. Are we going to use race as a proxy for disadvantage, or are we going to use class as a proxy for disadvantage? To me, it seems like if we had nobody's tax returns, if we had no information that gave us a signal on how much need somebody has at the moment, it could make sense in such a situation to use race as a proxy for disadvantage, just because there would be no better alternative. And so it might make sense as a way to cancel out the effects of historical oppression and current racial bias to have racial preferences. But it seems to me like the moment you have a better proxy for disadvantage, whether that's knowing someone's income, it could even be knowing the level of crime in their neighborhood. It could be any number of things. The moment you have that better proxy, you have a moral obligation to use the best proxy that you have. And in most cases, I think that there is a better proxy for disadvantage. I mean, listen, I'm a Black small business owner. Okay, my podcast is a small business, and I'm the business owner. There are many thousands of Black people in this country that don't need any help, that are doing quite well. And the question is, what proxy can we use to motivate public policy that best captures what we should care about in trying to help people? And to me, it's always been clear that class is going to be the better metric there. Or if you're talking about a disaster relief fund, then some kind of measure of how badly a restaurant is suffering, for instance, rather than race. So I take one strong side of that argument, and it's one that I think we're going to be having as a nation for a very long time.